Hello and welcome to another episode of Bond Review. Yes, it has been a while, hasn't it? But this time we're going to be taking a look at the follow-up to the most critically successful Bond film of all time, Skyfall. Now that film was ridiculously profitable at the box office, proving that despite a 4-year gap, Bond could still deliver. So when it came to putting together Daniel Craig's fourth outing as MI6's finest secret agent, the pressure was on to essentially create another Skyfall. And that's probably where things went wrong. Those first three Daniel Craig Bond films formed a great trilogy. Yes, Quantum of Solace was considered to be a bit of a misstep, but then it was put right by Skyfall. This trilogy of adventures showed Bond, well, essentially becoming Bond. And the three films managed to do all of that whilst being all stylistically different and interesting. And then Spectre came along and fucked it all up. Yes, this is exactly why it's been 3 years since I reviewed Skyfall, because I knew that this was coming up. But the film is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year, so now's as good a time as any to finally give this the review treatment here on my channel. Up to this point, Daniel Craig's tenure as James Bond 007 had been considered to be very good. Casino Royale and Skyfall were both very warmly received, with Quantum considered to be nothing more than just a slight slip. Had Skyfall been Craig's final Bond film, it would have ended things on a high. And even though Craig's era seems to suggest that it's in a different, separate continuity from the rest of the Bond films, the way it ended would suggest that Dr. No could have quite easily been slipped in there as the very next story. What with Bond now back at work and ready for his next mission. Yet the fourth Craig Bond movie was released on October 26, 2015, to a rather cool reception from fans. Sam Mendes returned to direct, making him the first director since John Glenn in the 1980s to make consecutive Bond films. This is also the first Craig Bond movie that properly starts with the gun barrel sequence. Yes, 4 films in, they finally got it right. The film opens with an amazing, long continuous shot at the Day of the Dead festival in Mexico City, where Bond quickly slips out of his costume and makes his way across the rooftops to find his target, Marco Sciarra. Mendes would repeat this impressive filmmaking feat a few years later in the film 1917. Although the assassination attempt fails and a good portion of the surrounding buildings get blown up, Bond is left unharmed except for a bit of dust on his suit. He gives chase through the festival, which is amazingly still going on despite there being an explosion nearby. This then leads on to a fight in a helicopter above the city skylines, where Bond makes the somewhat unwise decision to bash in the head of the chap who just happens to be flying the bloody thing. Anyway, despite this, our man Bond successfully disposes of the terrorist leader, but it turns out that what he was really after was Sciarra's ring all along, which is emblazoned with a stylised octopus logo that will be very familiar to us Bond fans. And with that, the opening credits begin. Now, the writing's on the wall by Sam Smith. It's a song that does get a bad rap from Bond fans, but considering that last time we had Adele's powerhouse of a song, Skyfall, yeah, it does feel like several massive steps down. More soppy love ballad than traditional Bond theme. But hey, the song won an Academy Award and a Golden Globe for Best Original Song, so I'm sure that Sam Smith doesn't have any problems sleeping at night. Well, after he's gotten out of his latest bizarre outfit at least. Oddly enough, Radiohead were originally approached to record the opening theme for Spectre, and whilst the song they created was brilliant, it was considered to be too dark by the producers. I must say, this is very strange because the opening sequence is packed with black tentacles, skulls, fire, shattered mirrors, and funeral imagery. If anything, Radiohead's song would have fitted these credits perfectly, far more than the Sam Smith song. Radiohead could have won an award. Just let that sink in. If anything, Sam Smith's song would have been better suited for the Bond film that came after this, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. The opening sequence also seems to be a reminder of previous Craig Bond adventures, which does make me slightly worried that they're going to try and tie all the events of the previous films together in some sort of loose-fitting continuity. Still, it's a better opening than what Quantum of Solace got. Back in London, Bond gets his usual briefing/bollocking from M and meets new character Max Denby, codename C. Now, when you see Andrew Scott walk in, already famous as Sherlock's Moriarty by this point, you just know that he's going to be revealed as one of the baddies later on. Denby wants to shut down the 00 section entirely, which he believes is outdated, and bring Britain into the Nine Eyes Global Surveillance and Intelligence Initiative. Nine Eyes. That's not a sinister sounding name at all, is it? Back at his flat, Bond receives a visit from Moneypenny, who has brought him some personal items that were recovered from the wreckage of Skyfall, including some photos of what looks like Bond and his foster father, along with another small boy. Who could that be? Bond informs Moneypenny that his pursuit of Sciarra was due to a video message from the former M, believed to have been recorded shortly after she received one of Silver's video threats featured in the previous film. The message, intended for delivery to Bond only after her death, instructed him to seek out and assassinate Sciarra, and make sure to attend his funeral as well. Although it's great to once again see Judi Dench make an appearance as M, even if it is just on a video message, this does continue to concern me that they're trying to force connections between all of the previous films. Moneypenny agrees to support Bond in his investigation into the Pale King, a name that he heard Sciarra mention in Mexico. And yes, he's asking her to do this without M's knowledge. Bond subsequently consults Q and successfully enlists his assistance for the covert mission as well, again without informing M. We also finally get a proper Q scene with gadgets, about damn time, and Bond gets an exploding watch, so I guess that Q has indeed changed his mind since Skyfall.
Are you expecting an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore.
As Bond's Aston Martin still remains under reconstruction after the events in Skyfall, he simply steals another vehicle designated for a fellow 00 agent, 009's car to be exact. Bond disobeys M's orders and travels to Rome for Sciarra's funeral, meeting his widow, Lucia, played by Monica Bellucci. She's already resigned to death, expecting to be assassinated herself very soon. But Bond saves her and, of course, Bond being Bond, seduces her for information. Lucia tells Bond that her husband belonged to a secret organisation of businessmen with criminal and terrorist connections. Unlike other Craig-era Bond girls attached to the main villain, Lucia does indeed survive the events of this film. However, it is a real shame that this brief scene is it for Monica Bellucci's appearance. I was expecting her to be in this film for a lot longer. Using Sciarra's ring, Bond infiltrates a secret meeting where he identifies the shadowy leader, Franz Oberhauser. After hearing Oberhauser order the Pale King's assassination, Bond is pursued by the organisation's head assassin, Mr. Hinks, played by David Bautista, who has already dispatched a failed henchman just with his bare hands. He's definitely got some Jaws vibes on him, and he moves terrifyingly fast for such a large man. Unfortunately, the ensuing car chase across Rome is quite disappointing. Almost no other cars, no real obstacles. Bond's not really in any danger here. However, there are some funny moments where Bond comments on 009's taste in music, and because Bond stole another Aston Martin, there hasn't been chance for the gadget-laden car to be stocked up with ammo. It would have also been amusing if the identity of 009 had been revealed in a post-credit scene, possibly played by an actor like Idris Elba or Clive Owen, who had previously been considered for the role of Bond. Or maybe even Henry Cavill, who was actually the preferred choice at the time of Casino Royale's director Martin Campbell. However, he was deemed too young at the time to be portraying Bond, but hey, He's old enough now, right? Just saying. Anyway, back to the car chase, and we're getting some exposition via a phone call with Moneypenny, who has been investigating the whereabouts of the Pale King. It turns out that he is none other than Bond's old adversary, Mr. White, from the first two Craig films. Thankfully, this car chase ends on an exciting note, with Bond using the ejector seat and just walking away from the scene, looking effortlessly cool.
Good evening.
Bond locates White in Austria, who is dying of radiation poisoning for displeasing Oberhauser. White asks Bond to find and protect his daughter, psychiatrist Madeleine Swann, who will lead him to a place called l'Américain, where he will find Oberhauser. White then commits suicide using Bond's own gun. I'm glad that White was brought back for this film, otherwise he would have been a loose end. It was originally planned that White would have been killed off right at the end of Quantum of Solace, having successfully escaped from Bond at the start of that film. But those scenes were cut out entirely, so the decision was made to bring him back for this film. After Skyfall, I wasn't sure that we'd see him again.
You're a kite dancing in a hurricane, Mr. Bond. So long.
Bond heads to the private clinic where Swann works, which has got some real vibes of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and he tries to tell her of what happened to her father. She, unsurprisingly, doesn't take the news very well and orders Bond to leave, but he hangs around long enough to see Swann being escorted out of the building by Hinks and several other armed men. We get another chase scene, this time with Bond following Hicks in a plane. He saves Swann, but foolishly doesn't check that Hinks is dead. The pair then meet up with Q, who has some more exposition for us that links Oberhauser to Bond's previous missions, identifying Le Chiffre, Dominic Green, and even Raoul Silver as agents of the same organisation, which Swann identifies as Spectre. Now, whilst I can see Le Chiffre and Green being part of Spectre, I really can't imagine Raoul Silver fitting into this organisation, considering what an absolute loose cannon he was. Swann takes Bond to l'Américain, which turns out to be a hotel in Tangier, and at this point the film slows down a little in order to establish Swann as Bond's next big love interest. They discover that White had left evidence behind a fake wall, directing them to Oberhauser's secret base in the Sahara. Taking a train to a remote station, which has some serious From Russia with Love vibes, Bond and Swann once again encounter Hinks, who gets ejected from the train after a huge fight.
Shoot.
The ending to this fight does seem like an inconclusive one. I was half expecting Hinks to show up again later in the film, or perhaps be brought back for later films, like he really was going to be the new Jaws. In fact, considering the classic Bond villain that they bring back later on in this film, spoiler approaching, why didn't they just call Mr. Hinks Jaws as well and be done with it? But no, this didn't happen, either in this film or in No Time to Die. And with Craig's run as 007 now over, it probably isn't going to happen at all. But at least Craig and Bautista got to act alongside each other again in Glass Onion a few years later. And of course, such a death-defying moment is a natural aphrodisiac, right? So Bond and Swann hop under the bedsheets for a spot of afternoon delight before they're escorted to Oberhauser's base, a plush-looking complex that just so happens to be built inside a giant crater. Well, I suppose that volcanoes and secret underground lairs had been done before in the classic Bonds. Bond and Swann are put in separate rooms with family photos. Swann has a photo featuring herself and her father, whilst Bond has a familiar photo. It's the same one that he was looking at earlier on in the film, except this one isn't damaged. And here comes the moment I dreaded. The photos reveal that Oberhauser and Bond share a history together. Now come on, surely they're not going to do something as stupid as having them as brothers, right? I mean, come on. That was done as a joke in the third Austin Powers movie, Goldmember, where it turned out that Austin and Dr. Evil were indeed brothers. I mean, come on, one of the reasons why they decided to reboot Bond in the first place was because Austin Powers had taken the piss out of the classic Bond films. So surely, in a mainstream Bond movie, they aren't going to do the same thing as in an Austin Powers movie, right? Right? Oh, for fuck's sake. Are you telling me that at no point during the film's production did somebody stand up and say, hey, this is a really bad idea? So we finally get a good view of the main villain, Oberhauser, who reveals that Spectre has staged terrorist attacks all around the world, creating a need for the Nine Eyes program, which they have funded. So yes, surprise, surprise, C has been in cahoots with them all this time. In return, C will give Spectre unlimited access to intelligence gathered by the Nine Eyes program, allowing them to anticipate and counteract investigations into their operations. And just to prove that they have eyes everywhere, Oberhauser placed surveillance footage of Bond and White's meeting earlier on in the film, with Bond demanding that the tape be stopped before Madeleine sees how her father dies. Bond's reaction to this seems a little over the top and out of place, actually screaming and charging at Oberhauser. Swann already knows that her father is dead, so couldn't Bond have calmly and quietly just told her to look away? If Bond had actually shot White, or if the footage had been doctored in a way to make it look like Bond had shot White, then maybe this bizarre reaction from Bond might have been explained.
So long.
Bond is then taken away to a white room and strapped down for what is going to be this film's torture scene. Well, at least he's not going to get his balls battered this time. Oh, and there's a white cat in the room. So yeah, guess who Oberhauser is actually going to be? Oberhauser discusses their shared history. After Bond was orphaned, Oberhauser's father, Hans, became his temporary guardian. Jealous of his father's affection for Bond, Oberhauser decided to kill his father, stage his own death, adopt the name Ernst Stavros Blofeld, go on to form Spectre, and ultimately become responsible for several tragedies in Bond's life, including the deaths of Vesper Lynd and the previous M. Yes, really. The stupidity behind this is nothing short of astonishing. Does this make you appreciate Casino Royale anymore? No, not really. Does this revelation actually make Quantum of Solace a better film? Christ, no. Does this make Silver's attempt to kill M in Skyfall seem more interesting? Well, no, because it doesn't make sense that Silver would work for Spectre in the first place. I even went back and watched all 3 previous films again, just to make sure. Yeah, it does nothing for me. Did anyone out there actually like this plot development? No, I don't think anyone does. Which would probably explain why Blofeld's presence in the following film, No Time to Die, was kept to one single scene. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself here. To make this scene even more ridiculous, Bond undergoes torture via tiny little drills that go into his head. I mean, at least it's not a knotted rope to the knackers this time. Blofeld claims that if he uses these drills in a certain way, he can actually damage part of Bond's brain, including his memory, so he won't recognise friends and loved ones. Except it doesn't work? Bond recognises everybody else just fine and can still run around and fire a gun normally afterwards. Very convenient. Bond manages to escape his prison thanks to the use of his exploding watch, leading to a huge shootout with Blofeld's goons. Just when you think that this is the exciting climax to the film, where Bond fights off a load of baddies and the main villain's base explodes, it just ends. It just ends. Why do supervillains always insist on having these secret bases that blow up so easily anyway? Blofeld somehow survives this, but not completely unscathed, as he now has his trademark scar, and he is blinded in one eye. But Bond doesn't know that yet, as he returns to London with Swann to reunite with the rest of the MI6 gang to prevent the Nine Eyes program from going online and to arrest C for his crimes. Bond and Swann are individually abducted by operatives from Spectre, whilst the remaining members of the group continue to execute their plan. Q is ultimately successful in preventing the implementation of the Nine Eyes program, whilst a confrontation occurs between M and C, resulting in C's fatal fall, preceded by a notable exchange between the two.
How predictably moronic. But then isn't that what M stands for? Moron.
And now we know what C stands for.
Bond is taken to the ruins of the old MI6 building, where Blofeld has apparently been busy sellotaping photos of characters from previous Bond films to the walls. I like how there's no photo of Dominic Green. Even Blofeld knows he was crap. Bond eventually comes face to face with Blofeld behind some bulletproof glass. Blofeld tells Bond that he must escape before the explosives are detonated in 3 minutes or die trying to save Swann. Bond finds Swann and they escape by boat as the building collapses. Bond shoots down Blofeld's helicopter, which crashes onto Westminster Bridge. Blofeld manages to crawl away from the wreckage and dares Bond to kill him.
Finish it.
But Bond refuses, leaving him to be arrested by M. He then reunites with Swann and the two departs. Later, Bond reacquires his rebuilt DB5 and drives away with Swann, seemingly leaving MI6 behind. Yes, again, as the classic Bond film plays us into the end credits. Spectre marked Blofeld's first Eon Productions appearance since 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, although a character resembling Blofeld had previously appeared in the 1981 film For Your Eyes Only. Now, it's obvious who this character is meant to be, but because of controversies surrounding Thunderball, he was not named here and nor was his face shown. The problem with Blofeld's inclusion in the film is that they've reintroduced the character at the earliest possible opportunity simply because they finally could. Legal issues with Kevin McClory's estate meant they couldn't use the character until 2013. Now, what made Blofeld effective in the Connery era was patience. He was built up over multiple films as a shadowy figure manipulating events from behind the scenes. He wouldn't be revealed until much later, with Donald Pleasant's version perhaps being the most iconic. While Spectre is trying to do everything all at once because Craig's tenure is coming to an end. Now, Christoph Waltz is a great actor and he is amazing in this, but you just wish that he had more to do. Had MGM perhaps waited until after Craig's time as Bond had ended and started this new plot thread with Blofeld and the next Bond actor, I think it would have been stronger. But no, they were impatient, and thus we were left with this. And again, they had Bond and Blofeld as brothers, which would have been ridiculous anyway, but then when you consider that Austin Powers had already done the same thing a few years previously, it almost felt like James Bond had become its own parody. The film is overloaded, it goes on forever, yet it lacks action compared to Craig's other outings. The car chase, Blofeld's lair shootout, the final confrontation, it all feels tepid and safe. At least Quantum had exciting action sequences, even if you couldn't follow them at times, but with the rapid cut editing. Bond and Swann lack the chemistry seen with Vesper or Tracy, not because of the actors, but due to limited screen time. Unlike Vesper and Tracy, Swann's relationship with Bond doesn't develop enough to feel meaningful and make us think that Swann is Bond's soulmate, rather than just another one-off fling like so many other Bond girls. I mean, there's even a moment when Bond and Swann are back in London and she basically buggers off and leaves him, and he doesn't seem to be too bothered about it. Craig is as good as ever as Bond, and it is rather brilliant that the rest of the MI6 gang are in the field this time as well. Batista made an excellent henchman as Hinks, and I really wanted to see more of him. Spectre spends far too much time forcing connections between all of the Daniel Craig Bond films, and I'm not entirely sure why it feels the need to do so. Part of Bond's appeal is that you can pick any film and enjoy it without worrying about continuity. Yes, Mr. White was a loose end, which I'm glad we've got some closure on, and Silver's impact from the last film still being felt is brilliant. He destroyed the original MI6 building. He was partly responsible for the death of the original M. He changed the game forever. Even though he is dead, his actions are still affecting everyone. But making him part of Spectre all along? That just feels like clutching at straws. Had Craig's era ended with Skyfall, there'd be no complaints. But Spectre seems so unnecessary. Something a Bond film should never be. It's one of the reasons why it's taken me so long to review this film after I covered Skyfall. Part of me really didn't want to come back and watch this film again. Now, not surprisingly, Craig said that he was done with Bond after this, and that he would rather slit his wrists than do another. But in the words of another famous Bond, never say never again. It's been a good, bad format for Craig's run, but how does it end? We'll cover that next time in Bond Review when we take a look at No Time to Die, whenever that happens. Until next time, this is the Big Daddy D signing out, and I'll catch you again on the next video. Until then, bye for now.